So David Drew trained as a chemical engineer at the University of Natal, and he started his career in the amazing FMCG space at Unilever. He then moved around from various technical roles, production, projects, supply chain management, finally landed up marketing and sales of Lipton iced tea. He left Unilever to get into packaging. So he joined Boxmore Plastics in 2007, where he was responsible for the commercial and supply chain parts of the business as the COO. In 2017, Boxmore was actually sold to the Alpla Group, and David remained on before he joined Coca-Cola in a very exciting role as the head of sustainability, packaging, and climate change for South and East Africa. A very, very challenging role, David, I'm sure. He's been a director at Petco since 2015, and he also represents Coca-Cola on the boards of Metpac SA and the Glass Recycling Company. I think we can understand why that's such an important role. He also serves as a technical advisor to the boards of Petco Kenya and Petco Ethiopia. So I can't think of a more qualified person to address us on this very important subject. And so over to you, David. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Linda, and good morning to all of you. I hope the rains have come and things are looking better than they did last year. It certainly has been a lovely September here in Johannesburg. So before we go on, I think Linda's done a great job of introducing me. As she said, I'm going to talk a little bit about EPR, and then I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the Section 18 notice that you guys are probably aware of, but just a little bit of sort of some other stuff about me, as Linda's given you most of the boring stuff. But anyway, I'm a South African. I grew up in Durban, as my wife reminds me constantly, is still evident from my accent. But for my sins, I've been in Johannesburg for quite a long time now. Sort of moved around, as she said, and perhaps my kind of logic is that perhaps maybe I've deserved to try and clean up some bottles after making plastic bottles for 12 years. My time at Coca-Cola is some kind of penance. As you can probably see from the pictures, I have a wife and a son. We love to travel and experience the world, and particularly go to the bush. I used to be a runner, but then I got better, so now I spend most of my time on a bicycle. And despite my time in the plastics industry, which may sound a little bit of an ironic sort of space, I've always had a passion for the environment, and that's why I became a director of Petco, and that's why I've got a passion for EPR. So I'm hoping that I can share a bit of that with you today, and help you understand a little bit about it. So let's get into it. So before we go into EPR, I think it's good to sort of take a broad view of the picture. And the challenge that we have is societies around the world have many of the same needs, but they have vastly different solutions to solving these needs. So these solutions develop not only in response to the need itself, but are heavily influenced by the context. The society, the geography, and the economic environment all contribute significantly to the solutions. So we often look for best practice or ideas that develop independently elsewhere and adapt them where we can. But sometimes we have to accept that what works in one part of the world simply won't work in another. So when it comes to waste management and recycling, I think we tend to be a bit more utopian. We see what happens in the developed world in particular, and we imagine that these solutions can be applied here. We imagine solutions to recycling that look like this: return vending machines, multicolored bins, curbside collection, and automated recycling plants that can ingeniously separate our waste and separate into useful parts. But in South Africa and much of the rest of the developing world, our reality looks very different. Recycling looks a lot more like this: far less sophisticated, but not necessarily that much less effective. It may seem hard to believe, but many emerging countries actually have comparable or better collection recycling rates than many of the far richer or developed ones, in particular the USA. So it's not all bad news. But when it comes to bullet trains and some of these other amazing public infrastructure that we might see in international cities, we seem to accept that these fantastic solutions might be out of our price range. or maybe be a solution for 2030 or 2050 in some world-class African city of the future. When it comes to recycling, however, we seem to be far less patient. We seem to want and expect these kinds of solutions now. And rightly so. We shouldn't have to live in polluted cities with poor or non-existent waste management. The challenge is that, like bullet trains, these kinds of solutions are not free. So governments everywhere are grappling with the challenge of providing the kinds of services that citizens want, but simply don't have the money for. As you can imagine, a concept that then suggests that producers of products that become waste should pay for it to be collected and recycled starts to sound like a really good idea. And that's one of the reasons why extended producer responsibility, or EPR, is gaining traction globally. But what exactly is EPR? So it has slightly different interpretations across the world, but EPR is really a concept that seeks to link the producer of waste with the costs of cleaning it up. It's like insisting that dog walkers use a pooper scooper. If you have a dog and you want to walk the dog in the park, you need to clean up after your dog. In principle, it seems to link the external or indirect costs and consequences of making something or using with the cost of using that material. The more difficult it is to properly manage a material after use, the more cost should be attached to using that material in the form of an EPR fee. So in other words, the EPR fee is applied at the use of the material. So this concept is called ECO-MODULATION, and it should, if properly applied, encourage better material choices and product design. So if you're a producer of plastic packaging, you have a responsibility to ensure that the plastic can be properly managed after it has been used. I say managed because there's actually no implicit requirement in recycling for recycling in EPR. But what's important is that you stop the product from having a negative impact on the environment. Recycling is therefore one of the potential solutions. Now, it's generally impractical for individuals or even companies to try and address these kinds of issues alone. So we form and we contribute financially to what are called producer responsibility organizations. So those are organizations like Petco and Medpac and Glass Recycling Company. As a collective, we seek to address the need to properly manage the impact of these products after they've been used. So PROs like Petco are the way in which we as industry or producers will meet these obligations. These obligations generally have some common goals like reducing the use of unnecessary materials and increasing recycling. But in the developing world, we sometimes see the scope of EPR being expanded to try and address some social issues like the role of informal collectors or job creation or transformation. Now, understanding the obligations of PROs in an environment where we have both government and municipalities and the private sector operating can be difficult. So I'm going to try and show you how I think it's easiest to understand EPR. I started off talking about trains, so maybe a nice way to think about EPR and to remember this discussion is to think about the mind the gap signs that some of you may be familiar with from the London Underground. EPR is about closing the gap. What gap, you may ask? Recycling is a business. People make money from recycling. So why do we have to close a gap? Well, I want you to think about the value chain in two halves. On the left-hand side, you have the cost of collecting, sorting, cleaning, processing the recyclables into a form that can be used by a converter. And on the right, you have what a converter is willing to pay for that recycled material. It's a principle common to many commercial supply chains. The best comparison is probably mining. Take gold mining, for example, which we should all be familiar with. Gold is extracted from deep underground, the ore is crushed and treated to isolate the gold. The gold is then refined and it's finally sold. Now, like mining, the challenge with recycling is that sometimes the cost to recover and process the recyclables exceeds the value that someone is willing to pay for it. Like mining, the end-use price can be influenced by market forces over which you have no control. Oil price, rand, dollar exchange rate, COVID-19. Now in mining, when the gold price drops or the rand strengthens, we hear about mines closing shafts or shutting down. Critically, they aren't typically shutting down because there's no more gold left. They stop operating because it doesn't make economic sense to continue. In recycling, the same applies. At times, it doesn't make economic sense to keep recycling, or it only makes sense to dig so deep, as it were. The difference is that with collecting recyclables, we aren't okay with, as society, with recyclers suddenly just stopping or our recyclables going to landfill. And so EPR is about closing the economic gap to ensure that recycling continues even when it would otherwise not make economic sense. Now, the challenge with recycling is that this value chain must typically interact with the broader sphere of government and waste management. Waste management is generally a service provided by governments and municipalities, so sometimes we forget or we ignore the cost of providing these services. I think most of us can understand that providing these services for general waste costs money. But when it comes to recycling, we tend to jump to the conclusion that collecting recyclables is now a profitable enterprise. This is unfortunately seldom true. So if we want recycling to be universal, the challenge becomes, how do we pay for it? And as I see it, there are typically 4 models most commonly employed to pay for it. And at the center of all of these, fortunately, you and I, the consumer. Governments can encourage recycling through policy, taxes, and incentives, and in some cases, they may even operate the systems themselves. Most commonly, municipalities integrate recycling into the broader waste management, and citizens essentially pay for this through their rates. They can also incentivize recycling through landfill fees or pay-as-you-throw systems. Container deposit systems, that's the CDS on the bottom right-hand side there, can be applied for some products, and they essentially put the responsibility on the consumer. The consumer pays a deposit and only gets the deposit back when they return the empty bottle. Kind of like the old milk bottle system, but critically, this is applied to all packaging, even packaging that can't be refilled, and is quite common in Europe at the moment. In contrast, an EPR system sees industry take the lead in both raising and deploying funding to enable recycling. Governments and society in general then hold industry or the producers accountable for the results they achieve. A successful system clearly needs alignment with state and municipal policy, but I believe that in most environments, EPR-based systems can not only achieve better results, but can do so at lower costs. And that's why they're so useful. So I know some of you are going to be challenging my earlier assertion that recycling needs assistance. So let me expand a bit, because this is really important. The reality is that value chains for different materials and in different environments have a huge impact on the need for EPR. Many recyclable materials will be recycled with little or no assistance at low levels. So I call this organic recycling. For PET, this is typically in the range of 15 to 30%, depending on the socio-economic environment. So yes, you don't always need to fund recycling. But then again, the challenge is that we're not going to be satisfied with 20 or 30% collection of PET, are we? The challenge is that as we increase the recycling rate, the costs tend to escalate, and that gap we spoke about earlier tends to open. To increase the recycling rate, we have to pay more to the collector or more to the waste management company. We have to travel further to pick up bottles from smaller towns outside of major cities. And we have to accept colored bottles and dirtier bottles, increasing the potential losses. So critically, our ambition for collection and recycling, as our ambition for collection and recycling increases, the need for and the quantum of EPR assistance increases. So as I said earlier, this is about balancing 2 halves of an equation. Now, if we look at the right-hand side, we can expand a little bit to understand a little bit more about what sets the value that converters are prepared to pay for the recycled material. The first and obvious factor is the cost of the virgin alternative. This sets the base. The next question is whether you're prepared to pay more for recycled material or less. Brand owners are increasingly using recycled content as a differentiator, and in so doing are actually creating additional value for this recycled content. This is particularly prevalent in cases where demand for recycled content outstrips supply. In many countries now, the value of recycled PET, for example, exceeds the value of virgin PET as a result. Paying a premium for recycled increases the value and it closes the gap. But there are also other factors. In glass, using cullet results in about 30% energy savings versus silica sodiation lime. So this also creates value. Using locally produced recycled might also save on other things like import duties and transport costs. In other materials, there could actually be a cost to using recycled content. It could take more energy, it could have more material losses, or it could simply require additional equipment that you have to pay back. The other factor is policy. In some countries, there are tax incentives which promote the use of recycled content, or taxes for those that don't. Both of these can create value, and critically, where there is extra value in recycled content, the need for EPR reduces. The gap gets smaller. But where users expect a discount for it, the need for support increases. This is another reason why focusing recycling on the production of higher value items is so important. It can reduce the cost of EPR. Now, as I said, the value chains are different for different materials and in different places. PET has a relatively high processing cost, and by that I mean the effort and energy required to turn a discarded bottle into material that can be used to make a new one. Aluminium, on the other hand, has very little processing cost. Recycled aluminium can be thrown into a furnace at a rolling mill with very little processing. And this is one of the reasons why the street value of aluminium cans can be so much higher than PET bottles. Glass also has a very low processing cost, but unlike aluminium, the value of the virgin material sets a very low benchmark. And this is one of the reasons why glass has a very low street value and is a real challenge to recycle. So we have two major factors: the cost and complexity of recycling on one hand, and the value of the virgin alternative on the other. Once we understand and accept that the value chain needs support, then it's easier to understand how you can do this. There are many ways for PROs to influence and support the value chain, and not all of them are direct financial intervention. Essentially, the intervention has to contribute financially to one of the major cost drivers on the left-hand side, or it must increase the price converters or brand owners are willing to pay on the right-hand side. Either of these can close the gap. Critically, through what we've learned at places like Petco, we believe that it's critical to ensure that the support increase results in an increase of the street value of the material. And this is particularly important in developing economies where a lot of the recycling is done by informal sector. If all the support goes to the recycler and he doesn't pay enough to either the formal or informal collector, it doesn't work. So, as I hopefully explained, the necessity and quantum of support will also be different for different materials. As I mentioned earlier, this is called ECO-MODULATION. And this will ultimately be paid by the user of the material. So one has to start taking this into account in your choice of materials. So what we should see is that if it's implemented properly, the materials that are hard to recycle will attract a higher EPR fee, and this could result in them becoming too expensive to use. And what this does is it starts to say that the economic impact of EPR will start to drive better decisions by brand owners, better decisions in the supply chain, and make things easier to recycle. So I've mentioned some of the ways in which PRO can support and influence the value chain, but I'd like to share this diagram, which I think shows it a bit more graphically and how an organization like Petco or Metpac operates. In it, you will see a typically fair product to waste cycle from production of goods to consumption in households. And then we'll see how waste and recycles can be treated. In orange, you'll see the various interventions that a PRO can make. As outlined earlier, the PRO sits outside of the value chain, but it touches the value chain in a number of places. Money flows from the producers of waste, generally converters or brand owners, directly to the PRO. Then the PRO uses the funds to help the recycling system. In the Petco model, most of the money flows to recyclers, but indirectly increases the value of recycled content. The PRO also guides better product design through brand owners and interacts with consumers to raise awareness to encourage recycling. In an environment like South Africa, the PRO also interacts with informal collectors and buyback centers, typically in the form of equipment or mentorship programs. The other way that PROs interact with the value chain is through formal recycling channels. Here, support can be offered in the form of subsidies for materials collected and recycled by both waste management companies or even by municipalities. Lastly, of course, the PRO has a responsibility to collect and report data and to send that to government. So that's the introduction to EPR. And now, hopefully I've given you a better feeling about how it works. I'm sure you'll have some questions. Linda said she will take some questions now, and possibly while I just get the section 18 bit up and running. So effectively, that's the background for EPR. So that's the general story. Now we're going to talk about a little bit more about what is envisaged under section 18 and how that's going to affect you as producers in particular what you have to do going forward.
Thanks, David. I'm here. Right. Lex has asked for a copy of your presentation, and I'm sure that something will be made available. But specifically in relation to the content that you've presented, any specific questions while David sorts himself out and moves to the next presentation? Because we're obviously going to be getting into the legal stuff now and understanding exactly what the government is expecting of us in that respect. Any questions, anyone? Johan, let's have a look, see. Oh, this is an interesting one. David, would you like to give an opinion on the blue clover milk bottle?
Look, I think in the interest of honesty, it is a poor decision, and I think we'll explain a little bit more. Maybe I can put it in the context of what we've spoken about. So, I mean, to give you an idea, I was looking at an article from the US yesterday talking about the difference in value for clear HD in the recycling chain and colored HD. And to give you an idea, the current ratio of colored to clear in the US is about 8 times. So in other words, clear HD in the recycled value chain is worth 8 times what colored HD is worth. So what it really means is that by putting the color in, unfortunately, Clover have made that bottle less valuable. And the one thing that we've learned out of this process is that the more value materials have, the more likely they're going to get collected, especially in a system that's driven by informal recycling. So I think it's disappointing that that's happened, because essentially what it does is the Clover are a very big brand owner, and obviously there's a lot of material in the value stream, and a lot of that material now has become less valuable, and that has a direct impact on informal recyclers. And I mean, it's a similar issue to the reason that we've taken the green out of Sprite, is to make it more valuable. But obviously, we've got a bottle-to-bottle link there as well. But effectively, what we're seeing is that the concepts of eco-modulation and EPR are really driving that we make better decisions. We are making our products more recyclable. We're making them more valuable in the recycling chain. And by making them more valuable, we're going to make them collected and recycled more. And remember that what you've done in that value chain is that you've taken the right-hand side of that block and you've made the value smaller, which technically means that the EPR gap has just increased. So in a correctly allocated EPR fee system, the Clover Blue should cost more under EPR fees than a natural white bottle. That's kind of where we're heading, and that's where other countries are already, but we're a little bit away from there.
David, another question. What's your opinion in relation to the dairy industry? So if you have to compare the dairy industry to other commodities, you know, other sort of types of innovative packaging that you've seen in the sector, and then EPR readiness, do you see that they're ahead, behind, on par?
Look, I think the reality is that EPR is fairly new for a lot of people. So I don't think it's really fair to single out the dairy industry. I think through Polyco, the reality is that dairy bottles and HDPE certainly are well collected, and there's actually a really good recycling rate. So from that perspective, from a percentage basis, they're very similar to sort of PET beverage bottles, if not maybe even higher in some places. So I think HDPE bottles have a great start. I think there's a challenge with Tetra Pak, and I know that Francois is listening, and I know that the paper guys have got some solutions that they're working on. They obviously have a lot lower recycling levels, but this is something that's new to everyone. So I think it's probably the biggest shift, and we'll get into that right now, is this change in the responsibility from being very much packaging industry driven to being brand owner driven. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in the next few minutes.
Great. Last question, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Okay, so obviously when it comes to beverage bottles, clear is we understand clear and the opportunity to be able to recycle clear packaging. But when it comes to a milk bottle, it's generally a white bottle. But now your comment in relation to the blue bottle was the white is fine. We can recycle the white again, but as soon as you add a color to it, that's when it becomes a problem in terms of dairy packaging. Am I understanding you correctly?
Correct. So essentially white and natural, and remember that a lot of our milk bottles are white. So effectively in the HDP recycling stream, you have two streams. You have white and clear, and then you've got all the other colors. So they call it jazz for some reason, I don't know. But basically it just means anything. So pink, blue, black, everything goes into sort of a mixed color basis. And remember that when you're trying to put a color back into a color, into a new bottle, is that the more color you have, the less options you have. So if you're going to use it in black Addis buckets, then you can use green, you can use red, you can use purple. But if you're trying to put it back into a lighter bottle or a cream bottle or something like that, then your whites and your natural become so much more useful than colors. And it's very similar in PET. So if you want to make recycled PET, you basically can use, the ideal mix is about 85% clear and about 15% light blue. The light blue just gives a little bit of color and offsets a bit of the yellowing. So when you are going bottle to bottle, you need clear and light blue. If you're green or amber or red or opaque colors or white, basically, for example, in PET, white does not get recycled at all. So for milk, in PET, for example, white would be a terrible idea. So you've got to be very specific about understanding the value chain and about how the product that you're going to what is it going to be used for. And remember that the less options you have after use, the less value you typically have. So by keeping it clear, by keeping it natural, by keeping it white or sort of slightly opaque, you just make that material so much more valuable, and you make that EPR gap so much smaller.
Absolutely. Okay, David, I understand. Thank you very much. Can you please move on to the next part of the presentation, because I think now it gets to be a whole lot more real.
So let's see if this...
There we go. Perfect.
Great. Okay.
Let's go. Thanks, David.
Great. So now we're going to get into the sort of the details of Section 18 and the workshop. So for those of you who've been around for a while, you might remember that we had a Section 28 process in 2017. And essentially what Section 28 process was about was that it was about government essentially putting a kind of tax on packaging and then saying that all users of packaging will pay this tax. Effectively, the tax is nominally going towards the cleaning up and recycling and collection, but the reality is it was going to go to the fiscus, and then some of the money would come back to PROs, and then they would have to implement our extended producer responsibility on that basis. We essentially said that's a really bad idea. The money will go to the fiscus, and like the plastic bag levy, we're not very confident that any of it will come back, or enough of it will come back. So we argued in the submissions as industry at the time was that we agree to the principle of EPR, but we want to remain in control of the money. So as I've indicated, and perhaps didn't point out enough earlier, is that the difference between an EPR system and a government-run or a municipality-run system is that industry remains responsible for the money and collects the money and spends the money. And that was the key problem that we had with the Section 28 process. And fortunately, to her credit, Barbara Creasy, the minister, recognized this, and very shortly after taking office, she said, right, she's going to rescind the Section 28 process and put in place the Section 18. And Section 18 is an EPR-based system that basically says industry must take accountability, industry must take on the responsibility of raising the money, deploying the money, and solving extended producer responsibility, on its own behalf. So, as we've indicated, it's about the end of life responsibility that you have. Okay, and as we explained a little bit, it can be financial or it can be operational, but I think the most important one is to think of it sort of in terms of taking responsibility for it. So now let's go into a little bit more about what we said. We've spoken about the gap, we talk about closing the gap, and we talked about the potential negative impact of the environment. So recycling might be the solution for some materials, but you may have other solutions. So let's be clear, EPR can involve things like eventually waste to energy. It might even require safe disposal or landfill. So, if you think about things like dangerous chemicals, recycling is not an option, but EPR says that if you are making and selling those chemicals, you have to find a way for them to be looked after use, even if it means burying them in a deep hole in the Karoo, like you have to do with nuclear waste. So we've spoken about the impact of ambition. So in other words, as your ambition, your target in terms of collection recycling increases, the greater the need for EPR and financial assistance. So remember that this is something that gets harder as the number gets higher. So our other key for it is that we talk about extended producer responsibility, and essentially the producer is the party that will ultimately bear the EPR cost, either directly or indirectly, and I'll come to that in a little bit more detail now. So the starting point for EPR when you deal with EPR legislation in any country is that you have to decide which products are going to be the products to which it applies. You can't just say it applies to everything, as much as some governments have tried that, and Kenya is in the process of doing that, for example, is that it makes much more sense for governments to be specific, to highlight the priority items, and we've suggested that they call those controlled products. In Canada, they refer to them as designated products, but essentially a controlled product means the product that government decides EPR must apply to. Okay, and in the draft legislation that we've got on the table at the moment, they've pretty much covered all packaging. They've included non-packaging paper, which is quite unusual, to be honest. They've included single-use items like disposable cutlery, crockery, straws, and things like that. So those are not technically packaging. They might be plastic, but they're not packaging. Lighting equipment and electronic equipment. Okay, so that's the list that is on the table at the moment, and it's important to understand that this list can change and evolve over time. So governments can start with priority items that they really believe have an issue, and then they can add to them as time progresses. So now, what is a producer responsibility organization? A PRO. So we spoke about PROs. I gave the example of Metpack and Petco and Glass Recycling Company. But critically, some people refer to them as product responsibility organizations, packaging recovery organizations. But in this context, and in the context of the legislation, the term should be producer responsibility organization. Why? Because it's an entity that takes on the extended producer responsibility on behalf of the producer. So effectively, it's a bit like those of you familiar with operations in a safety environment, you'll know about 16(2)s and about vicarious responsibility. It's a similar principle, is that you can pass on some of that responsibility to someone through a process. And essentially, that's what a producer responsibility organization does. And as I mentioned, it's because it's impractical for each of you to do it on your own. And a lot of people and a lot of these discussions have said, but we're a small organization, we don't have a resource, we're not Coca-Cola, we're not AB InBev. That's exactly the idea of a PRO. A PRO is a collective, and collectively you're going to address this problem. So now the question is, if you're doing this on behalf of the producer, who is the producer? And this has been one of the most complex and most sort of debated things in this whole process. So what we've really done, and what we did through CGC SA, was to look at what is the best practice internationally. And the clear sort of guideline is that the producer should be the organization that has the greatest control in selecting materials and designing the products. Okay, why? Because they are the people that have the power to choose to use a white bottle or a blue bottle. Okay, if the packaging converter makes the bottle, they generally are doing it on the brief of someone else. Okay, so if the question is not who makes it, the question is who makes the decision. And the person that makes the decision is the producer for a couple of reasons. One is that they have the power to choose. Secondly, they are going to end up paying, okay, either directly or indirectly. And at the end of the day, even if you apply the money at the raw material side, that cost gets passed on and often inflated through the supply chain till the point that it ends up at the person that buys the packaging. So as the producer, you pay for it anyway, okay? Secondly, your name, your brand is generally on the product. And what that means is that when the person in the street sees a Coca-Cola bottle or a milk carton or a plastic bag with Woolies on it, they look not at the manufacturer of that product. They don't even see the little label in the corner that says Impact or Alpla or Transpaco. They see the brand. So the consumer sees you as the producer anyway. So the brand owner is generally the producer. In some cases where we've got own brands, and I know that's fairly irrelevant for a lot of you guys, the retailer is going to be the producer because they choose the packaging. And then probably not that important for dairy, but I don't know how many of you guys deal with sort of imported powder and stuff like that. But the importer or agent in the case of imported goods is seen as the producer. That's the view that has been shared with government, and that seems to be the consensus view. It was kind of government's view already, but as industry, we've kind of defined it a little bit more clearly. So, as I've indicated, this is global best practice. It's about who gets to choose, who gets to specify. And what's critical about this is that the person that gets to specify is going to pay, but importantly, they have the ability to reduce unnecessary consumption or undesirable materials. They have the opportunity to improve recyclability and therefore increase the likelihood of being recycled. And by doing that, they have the ability to reduce the EPR fees that are charged because they are the responsible person. So now we get to the sort of the brass tacks of what's in the document. What are the responsibilities of the producer? Now, as it stands and sort of in the draft that's been shared, the first thing that you have to do is you have to join or form a PRO for each of the products that you use or sell. Importantly, each. You don't get to choose, okay, well, I mainly use HDPE bottles, so I'm going to join Polyco, or I mainly use Tetra Pak, so I'm going to join Fiber Circle. You need to join a PRO for each of the products that are controlled. Remember, controlled products is just on the list. So for each type of packaging, you're going to have to join a PRO. Okay, so that's quite a change. Importantly, you're going to have to regularly and accurately declare your consumption or production of sales of controlled products by mass to those PROs. In other words, the principle of EPR is that you pay for what you use. So you have to firstly measure internally. So many of us, and it's a Coca-Cola issue as well, we measure in cases and liters and units, but we seldom measure in kilograms of packaging. So we have to develop a whole system to measure how much packaging we are selling in the form that is required by the EPR legislation. Then we have to pay the PRO or PROs, depending how many we have to belong to, either directly or indirectly. Okay, and as I said, it's based on consumption. So the more you use, the more you pay. The smaller you are, the less you pay. But critically, it's based on consumption. So if you pay directly, you will pay to the PRO, and if you pay indirectly, you may agree through your PRO and your industry that it's better for the supplier to levy the fee in the bottle that you buy versus paying for it directly. But that is where there's a bit of wiggle room in the legislation. The very important one is that you also have to hold the PRO accountable for what they do. Remember, they are working for you, okay? And by that token, they are supposed to be meeting your obligations. So if they fail, you fail. So you have to be involved, you have to hold them accountable, you have to make sure that they are spending your money wisely and that you are reaching the targets that have been agreed with government. There are a few more. So reviewing your portfolio of products and packaging along design for recycling guidelines. So this is about making better choices. There might be things that become banned or not allowed. Those are the kinds of things that you have to do. Government's asking for life cycle assessments, and we're in a bit of negotiation there saying, we don't really think that that's the right tool for the job. Design for recycling is far more useful. There's talk about labeling standards. Those standards at the moment that have been called out are relatively empty, so they don't actually place much obligation. But it's clear that if you want to claim things like recycled content, recyclability, there are going to be very clear rules about what you can claim. And we see a lot of this in the sort of green space at the moment, where there are very clear rules about what you can and can't claim, about composting, those kind of things. And then the last thing is that, and very importantly, is you may have to submit to an audit of a third party. So in other words, the PRO would have the right to come in, look through your sales, work out how much each of your bottle weighs, and say, okay, did you declare accurately, and are you meeting your obligation? So that's what you have to do as a producer. Now, what does the PRO have to do? Remember, we said the PRO legally takes on the extended producer responsibility of the producers that are its members for the controlled products which it agrees to operate a scheme. So in other words, a PRO is going to say, we're going to look after your HTP milk bottles, or we're going to look after your Tetra Pak, or we're going to look after your plastic shrink wrap that you wrap around your bottles. One of those things, or all of them, or whatever the situation is, you will join them and they will represent you, your obligations for that material. So how they do that is they implement an EPR scheme. So an EPR scheme is what they do. A PRO is the organization, and the EPR scheme is the action that they take to ensure that you meet your extended producer responsibility. So they have to support the recycling value chain to increase capacity, collection, recycling. They have to develop end-use markets for recycled material to stimulate demand. Otherwise, that right-hand side of the equation starts to suffer. They can develop guidelines and drive better product design within their membership. So maybe no blue bottles. Educate consumers and encourage separation at source and recycling. Accurately measure and report to the market. And remember that the PRO becomes a very important point of reference to government and to the market, because they now have all this data. They're the ones who are going to be able to say, this is how many milk bottles are produced, this is the tonnage, this is how many milk bottles are collected, therefore we know what the collection rate is for milk bottles. And essentially they've got to responsibly and effectively use your money to achieve the goal, the obligations that you give them. So that is critically what they do. So now let's talk very practically about what it potentially means to you, and then I think we can go probably into some questions. Firstly, start by understanding your controlled product portfolio. As I said, at the moment, it's pretty much all packaging. Okay, so all your types of packaging are going to be on the list. So you've got to understand as a producer, and many of you will be producers, what are the different things you use? Well, you use closures, you use labels, maybe use corrugates, maybe use shrink film that goes around the outside of it, maybe you stretch wrap on your pallets. All of those are going to fall into section 2018. So you've got to understand, be able to measure them, and ultimately then you're going to pay fees on them. You're going to have to register as a producer. This is one of the things that the legislation calls out within 6 months of promulgation of the regulations. Then you're going to have to look around and you're going to have to say, right, these are the materials I have. I know I'm a producer. I now have to choose a PRO for each material. Now, critically, we are not in a situation where we have a specified monopoly for PROs, and we're not in a situation where PROs can only represent one thing. So a PRO could look after many products for you. A PRO could only look after one product for you. That is going to be the sort of evolution of the PROs over the next sort of 6 to 12 months. And that process is sort of going to change the PRO space quite considerably. And to some extent, I'm really sort of interested to see what happens. And I'm not sure what exactly will happen. But all I know is there's going to be change. And PROs are going to really have to look internally and say, what is it that I do best? What do I need to do for my members? What do my members need? What could I do? How should I define myself? What should I represent? And how best can I provide value to potential members? So once you've decided which PRO to join, then you join the PRO and you start interacting with them. And as I said, you start measuring your packaging footprint and you start paying your fees to the PRO. While we're on this side of 2021, my sort of highlight to all of you is start considering the impact of EPR fees in your 2021 budgets. For those of you who are starting to go into budget season, you're going to have EPR fees in 2021 for maybe you currently contribute to Polyco or to Petco, but you're going to have a whole lot more in 2021. So start working it out and start budgeting for it. Also start looking at where your quick wins. How can you reduce unnecessary consumption? Remember, if you're going to pay for it in 2021, why not pay for it by not using it? Make changes that could reduce your EPR fees or improve recyclability. So you may find that within the materials that you use, like we talked about earlier, different colors get different rates. And interestingly, we were speaking to some experts a few weeks ago, and they were saying we should absolutely have different rates for different colors. And that should be part of the process to encourage members and the industry to make those better decisions. So you should pay less for white or for clear than you do for colors. You should pay less for clear PET than you do for green or for amber. So those are the kinds of things that'll happen. And whilst you've got this opportunity, start looking at how you could potentially improve your recyclability. Ultimately, remember that the less recyclable your products are, the potentially higher your EPR fees are going to be. And EPR fees are going to evolve over time, but that's probably the one truth that I think we can rely on over time. So join your chosen PRO, make sure that they're acting on your behalf, get involved, be part of the process, because at the end of the day, they're spending your money. You've got to declare your consumption, as I said. Depending on your relationship with your PRO, it might be monthly, might be quarterly, you might have to provide estimates. And then obviously on top of that, you have to pay your EPR fees. So if you're not declaring, and this is critical, if you don't register, if you don't join, if you don't declare, or if you don't pay, then you're in contravention of the regulations. And as a producer, not as a PRO, as a producer in your own right, you can be fined or as governments say, jailed. But we'll see what the final legislation says. But it's important to understand, PRO has obligations and producers have obligations. So critically, register, join, declare, and pay. I think those are the most important ones. A little bit about collection and recycling. I don't think that's too critical. So yeah, look forward to some questions.
Thanks so much, David. I think that I understand it a whole lot more the second time around, but that doesn't make it any easier to implement. In fact, the gravity of how serious this is and how challenging it's going to be is definitely a lot more clearer to me now. And just in relation to, there are a couple of questions, and I'm sure people are getting ready to pose some more questions. With respect to the current situation regarding PROs. I mean, obviously we have existing PROs in the country. Perhaps their role is going to change slightly because of the new regulation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be new PROs in the space. Am I correct?
Absolutely. I think new PROs are inevitable. I think existing PROs obviously have the advantage of having some experience. They potentially have some resources. They may have retained earnings. They may have they've certainly got knowledge. So they would often be in a better position to do this. And obviously, if you sort of deciding to join and pay money to someone, you might be sort of more willing to go with experience over someone that's new. But remember that this is a changing environment, and I think there's two things that are happening. One is it was a sort of self-imposed restriction that PROs really only looked after a material, and it was kind of like, well, we've got the PET guys, we've got the polyolefin guys, we've got the metal, we've got the glass, we've got the paper. Well, everyone's in their box. What we see overseas and in many countries is that we have multi-material PROs, and that's actually more common than less common, which is interesting. And so that could be an eventuality. Obviously, where we are is a little bit different, so it may not go in that direction. But the other thing to remember is that as a producer, you probably don't want to deal with too many PROs. So I think I worked out as Coke, we probably have between 8 and 10 waste streams. So dealing with 8 or 10 PROs could be really tiresome. So if it's 3 or 4 or 1 or 2, that would certainly be better than 8 to 10. So those are the kind of things that are going to affect the PRO space. And then I think the other change, which is important, is that there's been a sort of the PRO space has really been dominated by the packaging industry, which is how it evolved, and that's just sort of a natural sort of progression. It's not a bad thing, but what we see in the Section 18 legislation is that the obligation and the onus shifts from the packaging industry to the producers and the brand owners. And that will change the flavor of the PROs, because now they're less beholden to the packaging industry and more beholden to the producers.
Absolutely. And then just one last important point. The ship has sailed as far as commenting on this legislation is concerned, as I understand. We were granted an extension, but it was the end of August for us to shout and to make our noise heard, or otherwise to ever hold our pieces.
Yes and no. So the good news is that, I mean, obviously, I think the extension in the end worked really well. We had a sort of a real coming together of industry in the last sort of 2 weeks with a very consolidated sort of approach where Packaging SA, CGC SA, a number of the PROs all really got behind one proposal, which was sort of a redrafted version of the regulations. And I think that if we get anything close to that, we can be very happy. So it's certainly much better than where we were. And since then, so just to ensure that is that there has been continued interaction. Packaging SA have had some interaction with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, asking questions about that you know, what was submitted. And so there's been a few sort of interactions, informal questions about, you said this, why did you say that? Just so that they understand. So there is still a bit of back and forth, but let's say the consultation process is ended. And we, unfortunately, even though we asked for a second one, so we'd hoped that we would submit, we would get back a second draft, and then we would be able to answer, or let's say resubmit questions. That doesn't appear to be the case. So it looks like what will come out possibly towards the end of September or early October will be the draft regulations, and that'll be that. And, you know, failing some kind of legal challenge. And obviously the intention of the really detailed interaction feedback that we had before was to try and avoid the need for something like that, and to say, right, let's try and get to something that's really practical and actually adds value, and you know, cross fingers.
Absolutely. Okay, so a couple of questions with regards to the constitution of the PRO. So if we have you know, so currently, as you said, the PROs have come from the packaging industry, but are they supposed to include ownership or at least some contribution at board level or in terms of governance from the brand owners? Would that, I mean, be reasonable to expect?
Definitely. So in fact, what it says and what we see in Europe is a lot more involvement in the PROs from the brand owners than from the packaging industry. And I think it's important to understand that what you see in Europe and in a couple of other places is two sort of different organizations. You tend to see industry organizations. So in other words, you might see an aluminium packaging organization, you might see a PET organization, you might see a glass industry organization. They are the industry bodies. They talk about the substrate. They talk about, you know, why it's so great to use glass and why it's so great to use aluminium and why PET is so great. That is the job of an industry organization. That's very different from a PRO. A PRO is an organization which is not focused on marketing glass or marketing PET or marketing aluminium. A PRO is focused on collection and recycling. And that's why they tend to be different. You still have those organizations. So you still have a industry organization in Europe for aluminium and glass and PET, but then you have PROs and they're completely separate. And the PROs are far more focused on representing, or let's say, representing their members, and their members are typically the brand owners, not the packaging companies. So in Europe, a lot of the PROs are some of them, particularly in the UK, are actually almost waste management companies. So there's a far closer relationship between a PRO and a waste management company than a PRO and a packaging converter. So yes, that should change, but it's really important that if you are not involved in your PRO and you don't have some kind of industry representation or, you know, from your sector or whatever it is, then remember that your money effectively could be going to one of the other streams within their portfolio, but not to yours. So it's very important that people, that brand owners and producers essentially understand that they must get involved. It's the best way to get the right results.
Absolutely. I have to say it's just quite interesting that in the approach to regulation here seems to be quite progressive. I think if I take the dairy sector have been through the Agricultural Product Standards Act, where we have been told who will be enforcing the regulation, whereas here you actually have the opportunity to choose, the body that will be regulating this process. And it does definitely give us an opportunity as industry to, to be a lot more engaged, as opposed to just having stuff enforced on us, where we can't actually participate.
And remember that's the victory that was won in 2017, 2018 through the industry waste management plan submissions, where I think out of 22 submissions from industry, only one accepted the premise that government could collect the revenue. So it was a big stand to say, look, we're 100% behind EPR, but we got to take accountability for ourselves. We got to keep the money. So we've really won a huge victory, and the Section 18 process is what flows from that. And hopefully what we can get right is that we retain this kind of, let's say, a little bit of freedom in terms of the how we do it. And that's one of the things we've really pushed hard for, is tell us what you want us to do and let us figure it out, rather than being very prescriptive about things in particular. But it does mean that there's a huge onus on us as industry to make sure that our PROs are not some kind of dodgy compliance look-alike organization that actually do nothing. Because if that happens, then we can expect government to say, okay, we gave you a chance. It's like, kids at a party, have a party, look after yourself, don't make the music too loud. And then saying, okay, you guys can't manage it, music's too loud, pull the plug, go home. And that's what will happen if we don't act, and if we don't sort of make sure that what is done is meaningful and effective.
Absolutely. So I think, from what you've said, government has basically approved this industry-led model, the current regulations. You don't think that they're likely to do a complete, 180?
So I think the challenge is how much of what the looseness, that we've kind of asked for or proposed in our counter proposal versus the prescriptiveness. Let's say the concept, I think, is clear. The issue is really about the degree of freedom that we have to achieve it. And for example, one of the things that there's been a lot of interaction with is how do we excuse me, how do we bring in informal collection into the system? Government's very concerned about informal collection, and rightly so. They collect 80% of our recyclables, and yet they're kind of on the fringes of the system. And what government said was, okay, we want to see something in the regulations that is going to make informal collection part of the process. So they said, well, you must pay them a salary and do stuff. And we quite rightly said, we can't do that. We know we've got to work with informal collectors. We know we've got to make them part of the system, but we cannot just pay them a salary. Then they're not informal collectors. And if you tell us that we've got to go and collect on their behalf, then we'll engage with waste management companies. They might employ them, but then again, they won't be informal collectors. They'll be formal employees. So how do we find this balance between government and a very real need to make a difference and to bring in informal collection versus saying, this is how you shall do it, and we'll put this into the regulations. So the regulations should say we need to work with municipalities to integrate informal collectors. The regulations shouldn't say you must pay them a salary and improve their quality of life and ensure social cohesion and ensure fair pricing for recyclables. We can't do that as much as we would like to do it. So those are the challenges that we have with what will come back. It's how much of the what or of the how versus what. If the what is increased recycling rate, great. But the how is going to be different for almost every material. How exactly the PRO should push the different buttons in the recycling value chain to make it work. And what we're hoping is that we get told what we need to do, but not how we need to do it. But then the onus is on us to make sure that we actually do it.
Absolutely. Okay, in relation to, again, just one technical question in relation to a PRO. I mean, if you take you did speak about the Tetra Pak, the sort of long life packaging and the challenges that there are around that, and I know Francois is listening. This, if you take that particular PRO and how it's currently would be constituted, you've got a number of different brand owners using the same technology. You've obviously got, the one organization that's very involved in terms of providing that solution. How are we going to make sure everyone is balanced correctly, particularly when it comes to this kind of packaging, which is, very, very prevalent?
So I think the first thing that you must sort of acknowledge is that it doesn't make sense. Well, it probably doesn't make sense to have multiple organizations representing, let's call it what we call carton packs. Sorry, that's Coke speak, but brick packs or whatever else, but flexible cartons. So, and the reason for that is that so it wouldn't make sense for Tetra Pak or Elo Pak or SIG or whatever, each to have separate industries, because from a waste recycling point of view, it's important to understand, and one of the things I believe is that it doesn't make sense for a PRO to split a waste stream. And why I say waste stream is that waste streams are identifiable. So my sort of facetious example is you shouldn't say that I represent shampoo bottles but not conditioner bottles, because from a waste stream perspective, no one can tell the difference. Okay. If you had a different waste stream, is there a different waste stream for dairy bottles versus shampoo bottles? Yes, there is. Okay, so those are identifiable. And similarly in PET, you have a different waste stream for thermoforms as you do for beverage bottles. But so your starting point should be, what is the waste stream? And if the waste stream is flexible cartons, then that ideally should be a single PRO, or one PRO could represent other things as well, looks after that waste stream on behalf of SIG, Combi, Block, all of the different materials. Then those producers that are using that material, so if you are a user of Tetra Pak or Elo Pak or whatever it is, you come together and you say, right, how are we going to address this? How are we going to find solutions to increase the recycling of Tetra Paks? And remember, this has been done all over the world, so there's some good examples of where it can be. And then you have to agree how much you pay. You should all pay the same rate per kilo, unless there's a material choice in it that makes one type of packaging more difficult to recycle than another. So if you have some with aluminium and some without aluminium, you might say with aluminium needs a higher rate than without aluminium, or vice versa, depending what the economics of the recycling value chain are. So that is the challenge that you've got to put together. First, you've got to bring together the producers, say we've got a problem to solve. We're sitting at 17% collection. We need to get to 50. How are we going to do it? Well, we've got a, Impact are willing to work with us, or this person wants to get the fiber back. Then you have to say, right, how much money is it going to take? And to give you an idea, I was at a recycler 2 weeks ago, and they had a huge pile of Tetra Paks in the corner. And I said, what's that? They said, no one wants it. They offered us 10 cents a kilo for it, so we're not going to sell it. Hopefully it'll become worth more at some point. So if it's not valuable, it's not going to move, and if it's not going to move, it's not going to get collected. So you're not going to get there. So you have to create that value, and that value's got to come through the recycling value chain and the end products, and it's going to make sense to do it all together. But from a big producer, small producer, you should be paying the same rate for the same material, or the same type of material, and you should be paying it based on your consumption. So Clover's going to pay more than Douglas does.
Absolutely. Okay, so two questions about enforcement, or really the role of government. So first of all, who's going to make sure that everyone, large, small, big name, no name, is registered with a PRO?
So that's why one of the requirements is that producers have to register with government. So and this is something that is a good question. It's the right question to ask. There may be a role there for the Waste Bureau or a part of government, depending on how the PRO space evolves. But essentially, it's important to understand a PRO doesn't have to go chase a member. Okay, if the member chooses not to join a PRO, then effectively they're breaking the law, and it's up to the department to identify them. So registering as a producer, we suspect will then say register as a producer and tell us which products you produce and which PRO you're going to belong to for each product, and you may have to do this regularly, yearly, or whatever else. Then the critical check, and it is in the regulations, is that the PRO will have to produce a list of their members in good standing. And so it's not enough just to join a PRO and say, oh, I joined once, I'm out of here. is that the PRO has to say, these are the members, these are the people declaring, these are the people that are paying, these are the ones that I've audited and are good, these are the ones I audited and they were cheating. Okay, so the PRO can have some indication of compliance, and one of the ways they do it in many countries is they have a public, visible list. So on your PRO list, it says these are my members, these are the ones in good standing, and so if someone says to you, oh, you know, are you a member, then you should say, yes, I'm a member, go and check with the PRO. So there can be enforcement within the industry. Obviously, there's sort of a bit of peer pressure. There can be enforcement from brand owners. So PROs can do things like, you can put a logo on if you're part of a PRO or part of an organization, so that consumers can see who's part of the solution and paying their money. But there is an obligation and there is an onus on government, and yeah, I think we all know it probably won't be foolproof. But that's the intention of the law, is not to work out how to evade the law. It's to try and make it as sort of let's say enforceable as possible.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's our responsibility at the end of the day to comply with the law. You know, it's I think that the intention of the law. What's the government's responsibility with regards to sensitizing the public to promote recycling? Now, when I looked at that very busy diagram, all the orange things had nothing to do with the government. They had everything to do with the PRO. So the PRO is going to be putting up the posters and the different colored bins, you know, for the benefit of the consumer, based on what I understood from your diagram.
Yeah, absolutely. So the onus really falls on the PRO, and it falls on the producer as well. So it's important for us as brand owners to start to communicate more of how people should recycle, what they should do with our packaging afterwards. You know, some of you may have seen some of the Coke packaging already, their messages about recycling, recyclability. So that's the kind of thing that you'll see. You obviously see it in you know, a lot of the retailers already do it. You buy a shopping bag from ShopRite or Woolies, it's got a big sign that says please recycle me. That's the kind of stuff that producers are going to have to do. And remember that to some extent you must look at it as an opportunity, is that if we can talk to consumers and drive the habits that reduces the obligation or the costs of the PRO, it means that we save ourselves money. So essentially we've got to look as brand owners of how can we communicate to consumers, how can we make it clear from our packaging, how we can design our packaging better so that it's easier to recycle. But at the end of the day, between the PROs and the producers, it's our job to do. Government can do it, and there's a big sort of collaboration at schools level. So that's the one thing that we believe where PROs can work at schools. But again, it's government's more facilitating it and saying, yeah, you can come in and teach in our schools. And as part of the National Waste Management Strategy, there's also talk about education being a critical part. So government are taking on some of that education role, but the real nuts and bolts are going to fall to us as producers and PROs.
Okay, David, I know we've over our time, but there's one last question, and it was inevitable that at some point we were going to talk about money. Yeah. So a very interesting question here, because you know, if we have to deliberate what the fees are going to be, how does this play when it comes to, you know, competition? I mean, we probably should have started this meeting by reading the competition's caveats, because, you know, at the end of the day, we have a number of companies that are all involved in the same kind of environment, and just being in the same room can be interpreted as being anti-competitive. So how do we handle competition?
So the thing is, you know, you got to remember what are the rules of competition, and what would you be breaking? You're not dividing markets. You're not agreeing pricing. Okay, what you're determining is you're determining an EPR fee that should be applied equally to everyone who's a member. And it's important to understand determining EPR fees is not simple, but I mean, there are some sort of basics to it, and essentially it's to say how much money are we going to spend as an organization, how many members do we have, how many tons of product do these members make, and therefore I divide the one into the other and say, well, if I need 50 million to spend and I've got, you know, X amount of tons to recover that money on it, I need to get my money at 500 Rand a ton, and then that's how it does. And then that gets spent. So what the members of the board are more about is about saying, this is what we want to do, this is how we're going to spend it, right? This is how we're going to raise the money, and essentially you agree to say, look, well, it's either 400 Rand a ton or 500 Rand a ton or 300 Rand a ton. If it's 300 Rand a ton, then we're not going to be able to do as much as we potentially need to do, and we may fall short of our target. And if we fall short of our target, then government may come and consider some other action. But you're not colluding in a way to divide the market, because you're applying it equally. So essentially, it's also not a case of, if you were saying, well, let's all chip in $1 million, and for a small dairy $1 million is enormous, but for clover it's nothing, then you could say, well, that would be anti-competitive, because you're dividing it on a sort of seat at the table basis and not on a consumption. But because it's done on consumption, it's equal for everyone. And that's the way that it's done. And from, we've done it like that in Petco for 15 years. And the advice that we've got from competition is that, we're not breaking competition law from that perspective. I don't think that's the issue. There is an issue when it comes to sharing of information. And I think what's important to understand is that because you now are going to share your information with the PRO, it's very important, and it's in the regulations, that the PRO must have an executive team that are independent of the non-executive board members. So the information that goes to Petco, I don't see. I can't see my competitors' numbers. I can only see the total number for Petco. Okay, I can work out what I pay and what everyone else pays, but I can't tell who paid what in between that. I cannot tell that. So that's a critical governance sector. So very important to understand. A PRO must have a separate and independent executive that will deal with the sensitive information, and the broad budget issues which become the EPR fees are looked at a sort of agglomerated level, and that's where the board come together and say, okay, we agree 450 or 500. 450 this, 500 that. It's tough, COVID, we'll stick with 450. And that's how it's done. So it's very important to understand there is a separate and confidential part of a PRO that is not, you don't see if you're a member.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. I think there's probably loads more questions that will come to everyone 10 minutes after this webinar, in which case, please won't you send them through to the Dairy Standard Agency, because I'm sure David will be happy to assist. On behalf of the Dairy Standard Agency, David, I'd like to thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you very much for your very comprehensive presentation and for answering all our questions. Everybody out there, there is a survey that Yompi has asked that you would complete. Please look out for that email. It will be coming to you from me within the next half an hour. We would really appreciate your feedback to be able to ensure that we have a sort of understanding of where everybody's currently standing in relation to these regulations, and also if there are any particular issues that you'd like to raise. David, thanks again very much, and look forward to seeing you in the near future again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.